Teachers at the INTO conference yesterday rejected a proposal that the educational body would work with the Department of Education to remove single-faith religious education from schools in state-funded schools. This came after a survey by the INTO earlier this week found that 57% of over 1,000 teachers support secular patrons, despite 88.3% of primary schools being under Catholic control, with less than 6% having a multi-denominational ethos. Niamh Uí Bhriain from Gript has been covering the story and she joins me now. Niamh, good morning.
Good morning, Alison.
Niamh, it's quite an interesting contrast when you look at the fact that over 57% of teachers support secular patrons, but at the same time, in that vote on it, 285 actually opposed the removal of religion from schools, with 196 supporting the proposal. So there is a bit of a juxtaposition between the two, isn't there?
There is, and I think you're raising a very interesting point there, and it's one that was raised by Caroline Moore, who wrote an excellent piece on this for Gript, and she was a teacher who attended the INTO Congress, and obviously, you know, this is the INTO's big conference every year, and it's where they put forward motions. Different branches of that teachers belong to put forward motions that are discussed then by the teachers. So if you like, it's where teachers thrash things out, and they vote then according to how they feel about certain issues. And the reporting around the conference, I think from RTE and others, was framed very much around, you know, okay, what do teachers feel about teaching women?
Yeah.
And they focused very much on the results of a survey which had been done by the INTO. Now, the survey, as Caroline Moore points out, you know, and she's a teacher, had a low response rate.
Yeah.
The INTO about 50,000 members, I think, both north and south, and then, you know, they surveyed about 5,000, which is fair enough for sampling, you know, but only about 1,000 responded, and you know, that was a 20% response rate, which is pretty low. And it found, like, she was saying to me that she was annoyed, firstly, because most of the coverage focused on, I suppose, the responses in the survey that could be perceived as being negative to teaching religion in schools. But you said when you looked into it, actually 33% of teachers said that they liked teaching religion, they had no issue with it, and then there was only 19.5%, almost 20%, who said they'd prefer not to. And then you had another group of teachers, about 19 or 20% as well, who said they would like to teach it, perhaps they would like to change how it was taught to include other faiths and things like that. So it was much more nuanced, even in the survey. Think she felt, than the reporting around it initially. And then when it came to the conference itself, as you just said there, really the whole issue of whether or not to teach religion in schools came down to this motion which had been cleared by Congress to be debated and then voted on by teachers. And as Caroline, as you read out there, it was a very strong motion. You know, it said that the Congress would work with the Department of Education to remove single-faith religious education from the day school in state-funded schools. So they need all state-funded schools in this country, as everybody knows. And that was voted down by a very significant majority. Like you had a very robust debate on it in the day. And then it was voted down 285 to 196, so a 60-40 split. And you know, her point is that you would never know this from the coverage. It was kind of buried in the coverage, barely mentioned, and instead, like the average reader or listener to the news around the INTO conference would come away thinking that teachers are very hostile to religion in schools. Yeah. And as she said, like when it came down to it, she felt that particular part of the motion was hostile, and that clearly teachers agreed, you know, that there isn't, that teachers' feelings on this, as you said, Alison, are much more nuanced, and I think parents are like that too. Yeah. You know, like some are hostile, some aren't, some are kind of torn in between. Certainly, I think some feel that there should be more divestment, but I think the church agrees with that as well. It just seems to be an extraordinarily slow process. But you know, her chief point was that she felt the reporting did not reflect what actually happened at the Congress, which was that when it came down to it, a 60% majority of teachers voted against a motion to take religion out of schools.
What I thought was also interesting as well was what a number of teachers said was their concern in relation to what would be replaced if religion was taken out, and fears that there might be a certain ideology that might be introduced instead of that. Could you expand on that for us? What exactly were their concerns?
Yeah, and I think, you see, that several teachers said this to me who had attended the conference, and they were saying that really in Ireland especially, there's there's a certain cohort of people who are very hostile to religion in general, and then they're hostile to religion in schools. But there's very little. It's kind of the case of throwing the baby out with the baptismal water, as one said to me. That's what I was kind of like. What will replace that? Because I don't think anybody thinks that it's simply a matter of taking, say, the moral framework that a religious education gives you, of taking that out of a school and then replacing it with nothing. And you've had bills, for example, private members, bills put before the Oireachtas by people like the people before profit, who are very anxious to have religion taken out of schools. And I suppose the question for parents then is like, well, in that case, what would replace it? Is it the moral framework perhaps of the left, or is it the moral framework of people who might have a very different worldview than a lot of people living in Ireland currently and sending their children to schools? And one of the issues teachers raised with me was perhaps this rush which we have seen in general throughout the country, especially by NGOs or those in state bodies, to embrace gender ideology. So to embrace this view that biological sex isn't real, for example, and that people can be non-binary, that children should be told they can be a boy or a girl, neither or both, And they're saying, will these things replace, I suppose, the moral framework that religion, under which religion is used to teach in schools? And if so, like, who has agreed to that?
Is that a legitimate concern that they have?
I think it is when you look at, I suppose, what's in things like SPHE. Yeah, and then like even programs like Busy Bodies for primary schools, which is largely harmless and a good program, but which does introduce children to concepts like that. But I think they have a broader point as well, Alison, and the broader point is like if we kick religion out, what are we replacing it with? And it's an interesting question because, when we think about things like divestment, and certainly, of course, if the country is becoming less religious and less Catholic and less Christian, and there's a need for other faith-based schools or schools that are non-faith-based, that needs to be facilitated. But the curious thing is that I remember in recent years when there was an effort to remove religion from schools in North County Dublin, in other words, divest them, that would no longer be under the patron of the Catholic Church. There was a huge kickback from parents, and some of it was like, I suppose, an attachment to things like,
of course, tradition
and tradition, and things like we all grew up with and we're fond of. But when News Talk went out and interviewed parents at the schools, some of them also said that even though they might not practice their faith anymore, even though one case, one dad said, look, I'm an atheist now, but I still want my children to have the moral framework that going to a Christian school or a Catholic school gives them. And I thought it was very interesting, and maybe that brings us back to this point that while some people are very, I think, hostile to religion in schools, they don't represent, I think, the majority, really, to be honest. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. And people are kind of thinking to themselves, okay, if we chuck it out, what are we replacing with and have we thought that through? I think that's the teachers are pointing to.
And to be fair to I think the majority of schools, if parents do want their children to opt out, schools have always facilitated that and have always been very good about that. So it's not like that option isn't there to opt out.
Yeah, and that's one thing that Caroline Moore and other teachers I spoke to, Helena Byrne and others, said to me. They said that obviously teachers, I mean, these are people who are going to the classroom every day, and obviously they have no desire to force religion on a child or children who aren't members of that faith or who aren't members of any faith. And it was their view, that some of the difficulties that children or families might face or perceive that they face are kind of overrepresented in media reporting. And they were saying, look, most teachers would go out of their way to facilitate families and not to cause any hostility or difficulty to families. They said, do we need to do more in that regard? Sure. Do we need to perhaps, introduce children to a broader aspects of religion across all faiths? And they said, let's discuss all that, and they've no issue with that. They've no issue with other parts of the motion, I think, which sought to protect the rights of teachers who don't have religion. But I think what they had an issue with this what they felt is a very strong hostility to religion, and that then is being, I suppose, reported on or represented as the view of all teachers when it's certainly not. Like, I thought it was interesting that they said when you broke down the survey into the different responses, like the highest response rate was 33% of teachers who were saying that they taught religion willingly. You know, that they didn't have any difficulty with it, while 20% said they would prefer not to teach it. And of course that 20% has to be facilitated and respected as well.
Of course.
But I think they're saying it's not as straightforward as it's generally reported. And in relation to this conference, they were particularly exercised at the fact that the motion which sought to remove religion from schools was rejected by a significant majority. They felt that was kind of buried in the coverage.
You mentioned as well the slant that was taken on this conference and the survey. What I also thought was very interesting, and I didn't know this until I read the article, was that there was also a protest at the conference with a number of teachers holding up signs, one saying biological sex equals fact, and another saying, Minister, let us teach facts, not ideology. I hadn't seen that reported anywhere.
No. No. And I think that, I suppose, brings us back to the issue, because those teachers who are holding up those signs feel particularly concerned about what's being taught around gender identity in schools. And they make a very strong case, I think, in relation to the CAS report in Britain. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be familiar, but if they're not, Dr. Hilary Cass, who is a leading paediatrician, was commissioned by the British government to look at what had happened in Tavistock in relation to children who might have been suffering with gender dysphoria, and then to look at the broader picture. Look at things like contagion, like why are so many young girls now saying they're transgender when that was almost unheard of previously, and to look at things like social transitioning in schools. And social transitioning in schools was where, for example, if in first or second class or whatever class, somebody came in and they would say, I used to be Kevin and now I want to be Ciara. And teachers would then facilitate that in school. So they would explain to the rest of the class that this boy was now a girl, and that they were going to be... They needed to be called by their new name, and that I suppose other things would be impacted then in relation to sports or bathrooms and everything else like that. So that's called social transitioning. And what the CAS report found was that it wasn't a neutral act. In other words, and that a lot of children who had been facilitated with social transitioning then were much more likely to go on to medical transitioning. And so it really, I think, should have opened our eyes here in relation, and it should, the Department of Education, and I feel, so I've covered SDHE stuff quite a lot in the CAS report, and their lack of a response to what the CAS report found was astonishing, because what these teachers are saying is that, look, it's not a neutral thing to tell a child that they can be a boy or girl, neither or both. It's not. These are unscientific theories, yet we're talking to very young children often about them as if they are science, and we're pretending that there won't be any consequence in relation to that. And I suppose these teachers said to me that the INTO had previously brought out an animated video in regard to social transitioning in schools, obviously aimed at very young children. It's for not just for primary school children, but for people in the lower years in primary school, and they felt that, like, the INTO needs to address this subject. They put forward 2 emergency motions which weren't then taken up at Congress. And I know Congress has a lot of motions coming in and it's always very busy and all of that, but I think the teachers just feel that this is a huge area, that the CAS report has been a huge revelation in terms of the negative impacts of teaching gender identity in schools as if it's scientific fact when actually it's not. And they're really concerned about it, and they feel that there needs to be a debate about it, and that the Department of Education needs to look at the most recent research.
So if those 2 motions were not discussed then and were not brought before Congress, what can happen with them now, if anything?
I suppose that they will bring them back at the next Congress. But what I know, teachers in the meantime, like, have been very outspoken in terms of you have a teacher like Mary Creedon and others, in terms of, like, who is deciding that gender identity should be taught as fact in schools, given, and it's not a political debate, Alison. You know what I mean? It's not about trying to do down people who are transgender or trying to pretend that you never have a child who has gender dysphoria. It's about trying to find the most medically correct, least harmful way of talking to children about these issues and then of dealing with it if it presents in the school. And, you know, like when you read the CAS report and then you look at that INTO video, you definitely would think, oh gosh, that video is on the wrong path. You know what I mean? It's not teaching children. Now the video has been taken down from their website, I think, but it's still available from the INTO. But like it's an area where we need, I think, to look at the most recent research and listen to the experts. And one of the things that the teachers tried to raise at the Congress, and I do understand that emergency motions aren't often debated and heard because there's a lot going on at Congress, but one of the things that they did try to raise was that there's a legal action now being taken by the two leading experts in this country on transgenderism, Dr. Paul Moran and Dr. Donal O'Shea, who have been very outspoken about the fact that they felt that the state was on the wrong path, especially in relation to children who are suffering with gender confusion. And they were very outspoken about the harms they felt were being caused by treatment at Tavistock and other clinics. And, you know, the teachers were saying, listen, can we pause the materials that we're using in schools in relation to gender confusion until this judicial review that's been sought by Drs. Moran and O'Shea has been heard. In other words, can we try to get this right before we just keep teaching it when in fact it might be causing harm? I think they were really, really important motions, and you know, they should have been heard. I understand that Congress is busy and hopefully they will be heard again. But in the meantime, I suppose you've got a gap of a year where you could be teaching something in schools that is unscientific and that increasingly research shows may be harmful.